All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It looks like our numbers are slowly tapering off. I wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Philip Dutton. I'm a program manager and supervising engineer here at the Division of Water Rights, and I wanted to thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Hmong interpretation is being provided for today's meeting. For anyone needing it, you can access the Hmong language channel using the globe interpretation icon as shown on your screen here on the Zoom controls where you can select Hmong. I'm going to pause for a moment now and invite one of our interpreters to share these translated instructions for anyone needing them here on the English language channel.
เป็นหมดชัยจะลุงตนอลเป็นลูกต้องปัสสนุนเป็นหมดชัยว่าหลวงมุกเดินยก็สายเตียก็ยตัวกงขอชัยว่าหลวงมุกเดินในเจก็ตัวเรามึงอยากขอให้เตียว่าอีลูกโลบเอกคังจะใจเดินย่อต่อเจอชาสีจะหกะ
And I will remind myself, as well as others that have us joining us to speak, to please speak slowly and allow for the translators to make their, or the interpreters to make their translations appropriately. During today's meeting, I'm going to be providing a brief staff presentation before we take public comments. I will quickly describe the purpose of the meeting, then we'll review direction that the State Water Board gave staff at its October 16th meeting pertaining to flows in these watersheds. We will briefly touch on the current emergency regulation that is in place and the changes that staff would propose to that regulation if it is brought back to the board for readoption. Finally, we will review what the board is looking for in potential local alternatives to readoption of the emergency regulation and other next steps. We will have ample time today for public comment. Today's meeting is an opportunity to hear public comments and feedback on three main topics. First, should the State Water Board readopt emergency regulations to establish minimum in-stream flows for the Scott River and Shasta River watersheds? Second, if the board was to consider readoption, what changes should be made to the current emergency regulation? Finally, are there potential local alternatives that the board could consider in place of readopting the emergency regulation? At its meeting last month, October 16th, the board acted on an item regarding flow efforts in these watersheds. It adopted a resolution that provides direction to staff on immediate and long-term actions related to flow efforts in the Scott River and Shasta River watersheds. In the immediate term, staff are to solicit input on readoption of the emergency regulation and any changes that would be appropriate, as well as alternatives to readoption. Today's meeting is a result of that direction. For the long-term efforts, staff are directed to develop the scientific basis for baseline minimum flows and initiate an economic analysis for such flows while continuing existing modeling and data collection efforts. Staff are to report back to the board on these long-term efforts by next November. The current emergency regulation became effective on February 1st of this year and remains in effect for 1 year. It will expire on January 31st, 2025, unless it is readopted. The current emergency regulation is similar to the E-Reg adopted by the State Water Board in 2021 and readopted in 2022. In both the Scott River and Shasta River watersheds, the emergency regulation establishes minimum in-stream flow requirements as measured at the Fort Jones United States Geological Survey gauge, or USGS gauge, for the Scott River watershed, and at the Wairika USGS gauge for the Shasta River watershed. The emergency regulation also provides curtailment authority when necessary to meet those minimum flows. Here is a quick outline of the different sections of the emergency regulation. Section 875 sets the minimum flow requirements. establishes how the deputy director may issue curtailments, and provides for local cooperative solutions as alternative to curtailments. Subsequent sections describe exceptions to curtailments for non-consumptive uses, minimum human health and safety needs, and minimum livestock watering needs. If curtailments are in place, they follow the priority established in Section 875.5 of the emergency regulation. Last year, the provisions in Section 875.7 regarding inefficient livestock watering were revised and simplified, establishing specific conditions for such diversions. Other sections of the emergency regulation establish reporting requirements, penalties, and information order authority. The local cooperative solutions provide some flexibility by offering alternatives to curtailment. Diverters on a watershed scale, tributary scale, or individual scale can develop and propose an alternative that meets an equal or better standard for approval. The emergency regulation also establishes a specific program of local cooperative solutions for overlying and adjudicated groundwater rights. The current regulation includes two new options for overlying and adjudicated groundwater rights based on input received from interested parties. These new options were the best management practices and the graduated cessation schedules options, and they were in place alongside the current prior reduction option we had been familiar with. For the 2024 irrigation season, staff received proposals that covered over 15,000 acres in the Scott Valley, or more than 85% of the acres irrigated by groundwater. The familiar percent reduction option remained well used, with approximately 45 or 46% of the participating acreage choosing this option. The new graduated cessation schedule option had approximately 42% of the participating acreage. An additional change to the emergency regulation in 2024 was a requirement that groundwater local cooperative solutions include metering and reporting of associated groundwater use. We appreciate the efforts being made to begin collecting this critical information. Proposals for groundwater local cooperative solutions for the 24 irrigation season describe 58 meters in place for all or part of the 2024 season, and an additional 62 meters planned for installation and monitoring for the 2025 irrigation season. Division staff are now working with coordinating entities to obtain the meter reporting data and compliance records. In one example of the metering data that was received, the division is able to see actual water use compared to very high estimated baseline uses for unmetered water use under that proposal. In this example, the proposal included multiple types of reductions and options that resulted in a total expected reduction of approximately 30%. The actual metered use shows a reduction of 70% from the estimated baseline. Improved data accuracy is critical to understanding baseline water usage and to quantify water use reductions associated with different conservation actions. This year, staff have minimal proposed changes to the emergency regulation in the event of its potential readoption. One set of changes provides additional flexibility to the meter requirement for groundwater wells associated with a groundwater LCS. The current emergency regulation requires metering at each well. This proposed change would allow metering of wells or for metering at the point of application, such as metering of pivot irrigation systems. Other minor changes are to provide additional clarity related to noticing associated with local cooperative solution inspections and the type of information necessary to support compliance with those LCS proposals. As noted earlier, the board is soliciting alternatives to readoption of the emergency regulation. The board resolution that was adopted last month includes 4 elements that should be associated with potential alternatives. First, alternatives should be supported by diverse watershed interests, which can be demonstrated by providing letters of support from tribes, environmental non-governmental organizations, agricultural interest, and other water users. Second, a proposed alternative should be enforceable such that you can confirm compliance and that there are consequences for lack of adherence to the alternative. Third, a proposal should be able to be implemented at a local level with local oversight and accountability. Finally, the board is seeking alternatives that are longer than the 1-year term of an emergency regulation. Looking forward to next steps following today's meeting. Most immediately, written comments are due by noon on November 20th. Then, in December or January, the State Water Board could hear an item related to readoption and/or alternatives to an emergency regulation. This timeline is driven by a desire to maintain continuity and to have an emergency regulation, if appropriate, in place prior to the expiration of the current regulation. Division staff are also to report back to the board on longer-term efforts by no later than November of next year. If you intend to submit written comments, as I said, they're due by 12 noon on November 20th, 2024. Email is preferred, and written comments can be emailed to scott.chastadrought@waterboards.ca.gov. Hard copy comments can be emailed or delivered to the division at the address here on the screen. But please note that hard copy comments must be received and not merely postmarked by that deadline. We'll now move into public comment on readoption or on our alternatives to an emergency regulation. We are here today to solicit that feedback. Again, should the board readopt its emergency regulation? If so, what changes to the emergency regulation are necessary? What local alternatives could exist in place of an emergency regulation? Because this meeting today is focused on hearing the thoughts and ideas of community members, we're not planning to respond to questions directly during this meeting, but we are available to discuss and answer questions directly and can be reached by email. Again, that's scott.chastadrought@waterboards.ca.gov, or you may leave a phone message for staff at 916-327-3113, and we'll call you back shortly. If you'd like to speak today, please use the Zoom feature below to raise your hand, which will place you in the speaker queue. If you're on the telephone, you may raise your hand by pressing *9. When it's your turn, you will be invited to unmute. Again, for telephone callers, to unmute is *6. When you unmute, please introduce yourself and provide your affiliation if desired. If you are participating on the Hmong interpretation, you will need to raise your hand and unmute when prompted. The interpreters will take notes on your comment and then translate it on the English language channel. If able, you're also able to use the Zoom message feature below to leave us a message. As a reminder to everyone, this meeting is being interpreted, and we ask that you speak slowly to assist the interpreters in translating your comment. And with that, we'll begin accepting comments. Who do we have first?
Ryan Walker's been unmuted.
Mr. Ryan Walker is going to speak now.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. My name is Ryan Walker. I am president of Siskiyou County Farm Bureau. We will be submitting specific comment languages in writing in the near future. For today's oral comments, I'd like to limit our comments to just 3 general points for the upcoming e-regs and really the process that goes through the next several years on e-regs. The first relates to Scott Valley, and I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that the regulatory base flow has not been met in 21, 22, 23, or 24, even though In 24 and 23, we could say they were very good water years. These flow demands are unachievable. Furthermore, the hydrologic model suggests that reducing agricultural water use will not meaningfully help achieve these flow targets, except in very specific water year types. The good news is that despite not meeting the demanded flows over the past few years, we were able to get Chinook into the valley at the appropriate time, and we were able to provide strong rearing habitat in our tributaries. Accordingly, the new E-reg in Scott Valley should focus not on one often meaningless flow metric in the canyon, but instead should focus on meeting life stage needs of salmonids in the stretches of the river that matter when those stretches matter. That means making sure we have good tributary flow during rearing time and making sure we have main stem flow when main stem flow matters. Part of, I think, the frustration we have on the ground is that even though we have good water flow and above Young's Dam or in French Creek, everyone is subject to the gauge at Fort Jones. And there can be times when Fort Jones gauge has flow and we're not meeting the needs in the tributaries. So we think we need a more nimble approach, and this constant E-reg hurry up and do something prevents us from getting to that. But I would like to see us start moving towards an ewability to use different gauges and to let producers off the hook that are not dewatering their stretch of the river at a meaningful time. I know that LCSs allow this sort of flexibility, but the regs put that onus and workload on the farmers who are not paid, don't often have the ability to do that work, and the regs could just make it a lot easier for us to do that. In the Shasta Valley, it's quite a different issue. We can meet the reg flows. The river is very responsive. In the Shasta Valley, it's a perfect opportunity to try and negotiate solution. The board and staff have expressed a desire to move away from E-regs where possible. If this is a sincere desire, there's no reason why the Farm Bureau and Shasta producers proposal cannot be implemented in 2025. This proposal provides identical flows to the regs for the vast majority of the year. And in the one very difficult portion of the year that hurts farmers the most, that sort of July-August period, even though it gives us a little more water to irrigate with, we balance that with adding water for fish needs at other times that the regs do not currently provide. And that seems like a very, very modest compromise, and it would be a shame if we're not able to try that out in 2025. Finally, for our final comment, there needs to be a resolution of the issue of what the flows mean in the regs. These flows, as we understand them, and as we understood them when the initial E-regs were instituted, are trigger flows. That is, when the flow hits that number, a curtailment order will be issued. That is not how they would have been applied, especially in the last water year. And so there were cases where curtailments were extended or issued when the flows were well above the flows in the regulations. In some cases, as high as 25% above the flow that was agreed to by the state water board and that was subject to public comment, et cetera. This cushion approach to flows is confusing on the ground. It makes it difficult for producers to judge when they would have irrigation available. It makes our job difficult, and it's just, it provides a lot of uncertainty into the system. In addition, by allowing these sort of 25% cushions on top of the regulatory flow triggers, the lack of due process in this whole in the E-regs is compounded. You know, it's bad enough that we don't get the benefit of CEQA or many of the other protections of California law, but now the actual flow trigger is being decided by we don't know who. And the model that's being used, we don't know, and there's no right to appeal. None of that makes any sense, and it creates a clearly unfair solution. The regulations were subject to a fair amount of discussion. There was a number that was understood. 30, for example, in Scott River is well above what's needed for salmon in migration, but it was understood that that was intended to provide a cushion, and now we're putting a cushion on top of that cushion. And so I would hope that the next round of E-regs make clear that whatever the trigger flow is, that's when curtailments are issued, not at some unknown number that's going to be decided by some unknown person using some unknown model. And that is would be the end of our oral comments. We will have, like I said, some specific written comments. Thank you for the opportunity to address the staff.
You're right.
Thank you, Ryan.
Who do we have now? Theo?
You should be unmuted, Theo.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is Theodora Johnson. I'm speaking on behalf of the Scott Valley Agriculture Water Alliance. Our membership, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you know, we represent a good chunk of the irrigated acreage in Scott Valley. I would start by saying that, I guess it goes without saying, but we disagree that there should be an emergency regulation being adopted. Simply due to the fact that we haven't had any kind of even moderate drought here since April of 2023, if I'm not mistaken. And we have had 2 good winters in a row. We've had some pretty good flow years, as Ryan Walker pointed out. That doesn't mean that we necessarily met the flow requirements in the emergency regulation, but that just goes to show you that those might not be the proper, you know, levels that we should be asking for. Certainly there aren't fish looking for water of those levels in the Scott River in July and August. But that being said, I do understand that this is likely a fait accompli. It's going to happen. So we would agree with Ryan Walker that, you know, we should be looking at curtailing when the levels get to curtailment levels. Otherwise, it's just really, really hard for people to plan their year. And if it's going to be arbitrary, and I don't know when I'm going to get turned off, you can watch. You can look at the USGS gauge and you can watch as it usually just kind of steadily declines. There's no big jumps in Scott Valley. You know, it's pretty predictable because as the snow melts, you see it just kind of declining, and you can plan. We can be a lot more strategic if we can say, all right, it looks like, you know, probably in the next 7 to 10 days, we're going to be at that curtailment level. But when it gets arbitrarily cut off beforehand, under the wrong assumption that it's actually going to help us reach the curtailment levels to turn everybody off, then it never has. Why don't we look at history? It never has helped. It never has stopped us. When we're on that downward trend, even if you turn off irrigation, it still goes below those levels and it stays at a pretty even pace getting there. So it's just, I don't think it's fair to us. I mean, it's not fair in the first place that we're under these emergency regulations. So it's truly unfair for us to have no predictability on what we need to plan for to try to keep our heads above water, so to speak, in staying in business, because our businesses rely on this water. Okay, the other point, I did appreciate Ryan's point about, you know, making the curtailment more site specific and a life cycle for salmonid specific. I understand that it seems like that has been beyond the capacity of the staff at this point. I guess it's just too deep of a dive, but you know, when you have year after year of an emergency regulation, you do have some time, you know, you do have some time to start looking at these things and with more precision. So, you know, if we're going to be in this endless emergency drought regulation, I think we deserve some more thought. And so does our watershed and the fishery. And as a final point, I really want to point out that the Klamath River water quality impacts are evidently really prohibiting us from getting our normal timing, which we all know that timing is a problem, especially for our Chinook. So there's a big lag. We saw it in the Shasta River first, and they finally came up to what, half of their normal. And then as the Scott started coming in a little bit later, as they always do, we're still just barely seeing I don't know what percentages is right now, but it's a small percentage of our normal. And so, and that's not because we don't have enough flow. We're not even under curtailment right now because we have adequate flows. That's well established. So I hope everybody's recognizing that among your staff and pointing that out to your board members, because we don't want this on our shoulders. It's something we warned about, and now it's something that we want to be sure like CDFW is also acknowledging, and I don't know what we need to do to, just be sure that that's being acknowledged broadly. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. Looks like Vivian, you'll be the next one invited to unmute.
Hi, this is Vivian Hellowell. I'm speaking today on behalf of a commercial fishing family working out of Humboldt Bay and ports north and south. And so as far as salmon in the Klamath Zone, we've been out of business for a long time. However, in your long-term economic study, please refer to the historic landings here as being the biggest in the state that drew people from up and down the coast, and talk about what the benefits would be of a restored fishery. We ask to be part of the community that is a water user. We're growing a food crop with this water. We supply high quality protein to our coastal markets when we have a salmon fishery. And it's an iconic and socially appreciated fishery here when we have it. We need for your goals of these flows to be recovery of these fish and not just minimum to keep them barely alive. Now, we're not even approaching recovery of these fish yet under the statutes of the ESA, but what we need is a harvestable surplus beyond bare survival numbers. So right now we're doing our part, we're not fishing. We are involved in the conversation. Our organizations like PCFFA and IFR will be providing written comments on your short and long-term regulations. And we need optimal and functional flows. I appreciate what Mr. Walker was saying about making sure that the flows are at the right timing for spawning and rearing, and not just mainly at one gauge location. So I want to thank you today for having this hearing, and that's all I have for you right now. Thank you.
Thank you. As we for our next speaker, I do offer a reminder, those that are listening today on telephone, *9 is the option to raise your hand on the phone and join our speaker queue. Next, we've got someone, MP. You'd introduce yourself.
You need to unmute yeah, you're unmuted now.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I hit the wrong button. Yeah, my name is Matt Parker. I am the GSA plan manager for the Scott and Shasta Valley groundwater basins. I'm speaking on behalf of the GSA board. Board members would have liked to speak, but they are still tied up in their own meeting. So I just have a couple really brief comments from the GSA's perspective. Again, the GSA is aware that new management solutions are needed, but continue to support volunteer collaborative solutions, and not from the emergency top-down EREG standpoint. We concur with the Farm Bureau's comments and that flexibility should be developed in terms of flow requirements in the tribs and the main stem, just offering better flexibility as a whole in both these watersheds. Point two, through the SGMA process and DWR state-provided grant funds, the GSA has selected the most robust set of hydrologic data available, and groundwater management decisions should be led by the GSA, who has been granted groundwater management authority through the SGMA process. We've continued to state our frustration with the use of the emergency regulations, removing that authority granted by SGMA. And because we have the most robust set of groundwater and hydrologic data, we should be part of the management decision and sharing the awareness of the watersheds. We've been sharing that data publicly in our advisory committee meetings. We've shared that data with staff. I also want to keep in mind that State Water Board staff regarding the Shasta model has stated that they will not have a usable model to run scenarios until late 2025 or early 2026. GSA has a model in the Shasta ready to use to analyze water management scenarios and solutions, and we're ready to help with that. And the last really quick point I have is that I again want to emphasize the GSA's desire to utilize our groundwater advisory committees, who are made of multiple stakeholder interests. We have agriculture, we have residential, we have municipal, we have tribal, we have environmental conservation interest, as well as making these public meetings. They are the only meetings of this type in the region, and offer a great platform to discuss within the realms of the SGMA platform, the ability to find management actions, scenarios to run, data to collect, and so on and so forth. So again, I'll stop there. I'll continue to emphasize from the GSA's perspective, they recommend volunteer collaborative solutions moving forward, and thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker that we'll be inviting to unmute is screen is M.R. Harris.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, please
Great.
introduce yourself for the group.
Hi, my name is Michael Harris. I'm representing the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the Klamath Watershed Program. The department will keep its comments brief today, as we know there are many others that are here to provide input on the readoption of the emergency regulations that will be establishing minimum in-stream flow requirements for the Scott River and Shasta River watersheds. The department's mission is to manage California's diverse fish, wildlife, and plant resources and the habitats upon which they depend for their ecological values and for their use and enjoyment by the public. As a trustee agency for California's fish and wildlife resources, the department has jurisdiction over the conservation, protection, and management of fish, wildlife, native plants, and the habitat necessary for biologically sustainable populations of those species. The department supports the continuation of the existing emergency regulations to provide minimum flow and stability for both watersheds that have been impacted by the drought. During the emergency regulations, the department saw improved habitat conditions, improved surface flows, and temperature improvements. As we move forward, the department would like to remind the board that the flows provided by the department to inform the drought regulations, often referred to as belly scraping flows, were not intended to be the basis for the development of long-term in-stream flows for the Shasta and Scott River watersheds. The department supports the creation of the scientific basis report to develop interim flow criteria that provide some level of intermediate protection and the implementation of the long-term flow setting process in both watersheds. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll be inviting Preston Harris to unmute. Preston. Preston, are you there?
You show us unmuted on our end, Preston. Oh, now you're muted. Now you're good. You're unmuted.
Not hearing if you're speaking.
If you're on the phone too, you need to press *6 to unmute.
Or check the audio options under the little caret by the microphone picture. Maybe we'll come back to you in a second.
Mr. Harris put in the chat that he is going to call in.
Okay. Come back to Preston in a moment. Next, I think we've got
Amber is the next speaker.
Amber. All right.
Hi there. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, first I'd like to thank the State Board for taking action to re-adopt the emergency regulations and undergoing the process to adopt permanent flow regulations. Although I do support the readoption of emergency minimum flows, I don't believe that these flows will create the environment necessary for salmon recovery. I think there needs to be a stricter enforcement in place to ensure that these flows do not drop below the minimums, because the baseline flows have been dropping below those minimums, even just this past year and years prior. And stricter enforcement could ensure that the flows don't go below those minimums, because if you're saying those are the bare minimum survival flows and they're dropping below those flows, that means that those are like extinction flows, right? And even when emergency minimum flows are in effect, tributaries are still being dewatered and disconnected, resulting in salmon strandings and rescue and relocation efforts. So because of this, I would encourage the Water Board to establish minimum flow requirements for specific salmon-bearing tributaries to the Scott and Shasta. Also, given that the board is undergoing permanent regulatory changes, I think it's important to use these emergency regulations as an opportunity to collect the necessary data to inform long-term management decisions. I would say, the board could include language to clarify that the approval of LCSs can be made contingent on a commitment to provide, for example, weekly water use data that is reported and made publicly available, maybe monthly. And then, they could do either their PG&E bills or time-stamped water meter photos, something that would show that they are being, using the water that they say they're using. And then, in the alternative, allowing the water board staff property access with notice for them to be able to verify if the specific LCS holders are not able to or willing to provide meter photos or meter data logs to some degree. And also, upon reviewing the LCSs last year, we did find that there were several issues with them. Like, for example, some of the LCSs were in acre feet and some were in cubic feet per second. So it's really hard to compare and contrast the different LCSs. Several of them described attached documents that were not uploaded to the public portal or not publicly available. So I would request that all documents are uploaded and attached in the single LCS document. And then also LCSs had their locations redacted. So given that the water board has limited access to availability to enforce and relies heavily on public complaints, it would make sense to have that information publicly available to allow for citizen monitoring. So, it's my hope also that the water board can conduct the economic and environmental studies necessary to not only analyze the minimum flows, but also recovery flows so that we can inform the long-term regulations with the data necessary to at least consider recovery flows on the Scott and Shasta rivers. Thank you guys so much for allowing the public to participate and for undertaking this huge project. And that's all I have.
Looks like we can try and go back to Preston Harris one more time.
So we can go with Miss Chichizola right now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, great. Thank you. First, I would just really wanted to thank the board and everyone who's been involved in these processes. For moving forward with looking at a long-term solution to this plan. I know that having these emergency flows leads to a lot of uncertainty for everyone involved. And I think looking at a long-term plan that looks at recovery flows and how to have a healthier watershed will also lead to a lot more certainty for everyone involved so that planning can happen in a better way. Until that happens, though, I do very much support the use of emergency regulations to make sure that we keep the salmon hanging on in the Scott and Shasta watersheds. One of the things I think is important to look at is the life cycle of salmon. So if a lot of salmon weren't able to out-migrate a long time ago, or many years ago, sorry, not a long time ago, then we're not going to have a lot coming back right now. And the fish are also triggered by when it starts raining. So I think that contending that Klamath Dam removal is leading to the salmon coming back at different times is when it's the first year of dam removal, when the salmon are usually triggered from when the rain begins and are impacted by out-migration 3 to 4 years ago, is not scientifically supported. So I just felt like I wanted to say that to start out. As far as these emergency regulations, I really appreciate all of the past comments. I do appreciate the mentioning that we do need multiple areas of compliance and monitoring and to look at different parts of the watershed. I do agree that's true. Obviously, we need to meet the belly scraping flows within the rivers to make sure that the watershed is connected. But yeah, coho are over summering and fish are going into the tributaries. So we do need to look at multiple places of compliance. And I also think that will help us to make sure that the temperatures are also appropriate for the salmon, because I know that that's been a concern and something brought up specifically within the Shasta River is that we want to make sure that not only are we getting flows to support the salmon, but that these are of the right temperature and not something like irrigation tail return that we're measuring. I also wanted to support Amber's call or Amber saying that we do need a lot of transparency and monitoring. I feel like there's a lot of people who are working really hard in the Scott and Shasta rivers to try to meet these curtailments, to try to come up with really positive local cooperative solutions, but there's bad actors too. And the people who are really trying do suffer when we don't have monitoring in place and enforcement in place, because if we don't have that information, there can be collective punishment. So I think that multiple points of compliance, along with the monitoring and transparency over the local cooperative solutions, could be something that's really helpful with these emergency regulations. Yeah, and I do think that metering and enforcement are really important too, because we need to know that people are saving water and not just trying to game the system. But I don't feel like I need to talk for a very long time. I mainly just got on here to say that I do support the emergency regulations. I do think achieving the flows in the watershed in the Scott River watershed is possible, especially if we do look into groundwater management. Obviously, the Scott River, because of the system it is not going to respond as quickly to curtailments as the Shasta. But if groundwater is considered within these long-term regulations and in the emergency regulations, I feel like we can get there. And with that, I just wanted to thank everyone involved again, and I look forward to being involved in the long-term process and to looking at actual long-term solutions and recovery flows. And in the short term, we support the emergency regulations with the caveat that we need monitoring and enforcement, and to make sure that the local cooperative solutions are something that are available to at least the public that's involved in this process. Thank you very much.
I think we'll try Preston Harris one more time. I see your message, Preston, that you're on your phone now. So let's try and get you speaking. Fortunately, I'm not hearing you.
Nat King is next.
Preston, if for some reason we're not able to get you on the call today, we can certainly chat offline.
Nat, before you do that, I just want to say one more time for Preston that he might need to push *6 to unmute.
It doesn't show that he's on a phone call. It looks like he's on the Zoom app. But Preston, maybe there's an issue with your microphone or something on your end. Take another try if you'd like, and we can circle around one more time as we get to the end of our list. But Nat, let's bring you online.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Sorry.
Hi, everyone. Okay, now I'm off mute. Great. Nathaniel Kane, Executive Director of Environmental Law Foundation, here on behalf of Karuk Tribe and PCFFA IFR. I want to thank board staff and the board for the opportunity to present comments. We will provide more detailed written comments before the deadline. To open, we strongly support readoption of the emergency regulations. We cannot go back to unprotected rivers in 2025 when we can reasonably expect drought level lack of flows, even if we are lucky enough to get a wet year. The minimum flows we're talking about are specifically designed for species survival in drought years and not long-term management. There's no cushion in these numbers. And further, Sigma cannot achieve what these emergency regulations do because Sigma does not cover the adjudicated zone in the Scott Valley, and it does not cover surface water diversions. But the state board has both the authority and the duty to manage all of these water resources together to protect the public trust and to avoid waste and unreasonable use. And the board has been doing that over the past several years, and we really urge the board to continue to do so into 2025. So the board should maintain these minimum levels in order to prevent the worst outcomes for the listed species, which continue to be at risk in these basins. And we look forward simultaneously to working with the board and staff on long-term efforts, but that's a different conversation, which we hope to have at the appropriate time. We have a few suggested changes. We want to continue to work on tightening up the LCS program to avoid the situation where the Scott has failed to meet the minimum flows at each of the last several summers. We believe that there are flaws that can be corrected. We've commented on those on the past, and we plan on commenting on those in the future. This is not to say that we believe that those flows are unachievable, but that the regulation needs to continue to evolve as we have more information that we've gathered over the last several years. It's also time to start thinking hard about protections for key tributaries. We've seen tributaries in the Scott, particularly Shackelford, go dry and get disconnected, even at times when the Scott is meeting its flow minimums at the Fort Jones gauge. This means that the Fort Jones gauge is at best an imperfect proxy for protection of these key habitats in the Scott, or in the Shackelford and other key tribs. Protection in an E-reg could be a flow number for these tributaries where there are rated flow gauges. It could also be based on just a simple visual evaluation of, is there water in this tributary sufficient for the appropriate life cycle of the fish at that time. It is just not reasonable within the meaning of the waste and unreasonable use doctrine for irrigation to be taking place in these tributaries when the stream is drying up, juvenile coho are at risk of stranding, or when Chinook cannot access their spawning habitat, even if the Fort Jones gauge is meeting the minimum. And this is not to say that main stem flows are not important and should not also be protected. The main stem is good coho rearing habitat, and the scientifically backed flow minimums in the main stem should be protected. Also, groundwater levels need to be maintained in the areas surrounding the main stem in order to support base flows and fast reconnection in the fall. We appreciate the update that Philip gave on the modeling information. I hope to see more detail on that before readoption. And we hope to see more implementation of metering and more transparency around the metering data going into next year. We're going to have more detail in our written comments, but I wanted to again thank staff for the opportunity to comment here, and I look forward to the rest of the comments that we'll see today. Thank you very much.
Let's go to Cody Phillips, and then I think we'll try Preston on the phone after Cody.
Cody Phillips with California Coastkeeper Alliance. Just want to start off by thanking the State Water Board for allowing this much engagement on emergency regulations. There is quite a bit less that you were required to do under these circumstances, and we greatly appreciate your willingness to really engage with all communities on these matters. I wanted to start my comments off by just providing strong support for readoption of the emergency regulations. These emergency regulations are necessary as a stopgap while the board works on something more long-term in the interim and eventually even more long-term for recovery flows. But for now, strong support of the flow numbers in the Shasta watershed, which have been shown to support habitat and temperature requirements, are supported by the best available science when it comes to emergency baseline flows in the watershed. And as I mentioned before, an absolutely necessary stopgap. So in strong support there. I'm going to submit additional comments before the deadline, but as a note, and this was kind of hinted on by other speakers, one thing that came out of the October 16th hearing was the need for additional property access to complete study plans. This was actually incorporated into item number 17 in the resolution in the whereas. And I believe that something that could be modified in the emergency regulations would be to give the water board sufficient site access with adequate notice under correct circumstances to understand the impacts of the emergency regulations, to understand how they impact fish, and to gather necessary data to move away from these reactive emergency regulations to something more durable and long-term. Like I mentioned, there'll be more details in the comments to come, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak here today.
Thank you. As we approach the end of our speaker queue, one last reminder for those that are on the telephone, if you need to, *9 raises your hand, and *6 will unmute you when prompted by staff. The next caller we will try and take is the one cell phone number ending in 395. You can do *6 to unmute.
Philip, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Preston Harris here. I apologize about the last few minutes. For whatever reason, my computer wasn't wanting to unmute me.
Got you now, so we're set.
Appreciate it. Okay, Preston Harris, Executive Director of the Scott River Water Trust, and we, our organization, obviously does a lot with flow here in the Scott River watershed. We're focused on improving in-stream conditions on a permanent basis via the voluntary process, working with our landowner groups, NGOs, and agency partners to achieve long-term sustainability goals in terms of flow. Our role in the LCS program this year was as a third-party monitoring entity. And I would say that we probably did about 3/4. We did the monitoring for about 3/4 of the LCS proposals that went out. And I can tell you that from our experience, the landowners in the Scott River watershed took this very seriously. They were all they had all of their LCS proposals very well laid out for us when we came to meet. They were very accommodating when we asked questions or we needed to do additional outreach. So we would like to take the opportunity to talk about the ways that this monitoring process could be improved, and what we'd like to do that at another time with the state. But just wanted to definitely comment that the water users in the Scott River watershed, from our experience, took the LCS process very seriously, and they were very much intent on making sure that they followed the guidelines in the proposals. Other comments that we have, and some of these are definitely going to be kind of echoed in a sense, but there does need to be better clarification on the curtailment time period. That seemed to be something that folks in the watershed were very confused about. If there is a cushion period, if the curtailment period is conditional, that just kind of seemed to be something that folks just weren't overly aware of, and so perhaps some better communication on either end would help there. The flow trigger process does seem to be somewhat vague and if not a bit arbitrary. It is hard to manage a system when you only have one gauge that you're operating on down in the the Scott River Canyon, which is several miles away from any agricultural activities. So we would definitely endorse and support establishing a more localized gauging network, so we can monitor and try to manage the system accordingly, not just based off of a one gauge down in the canyon. So having additional flow gauges and using those gauges for a more localized management practice would be very beneficial. We also would like to know what is being done other than just visual observation to actually monitor the effectiveness of the LCS requirements. So where many folks have said that there have been improvements in temperature and flow, and we're not necessarily opposing that, we're just not seeing any type of monitoring network established that can actually justify the existence of the LCS program. So we would definitely advocate for improved monitoring activities for sure. And then also, we just want to make sure that we're promoting the voluntary process. So there's a lot of work that gets done in this basin with these landowners where all the information that we really have is based off of the voluntary process. And if that's flow data, temperature data, fisheries data, it's because the landowners in the basin over the last 20 to 25 years have been offering the access for us to collect that information and essentially provide it back to larger groups. We don't want to lose sight of the fact that the voluntary process has given us the ability to collect the information, give us the knowledge that we have to date, and that it's something that should always be in the forefront. Voluntary actions work. There's plenty of information out there that shows that landowners are very much intent on participating in voluntary programs. And those voluntary programs are mostly related to long-term and permanent water dedication opportunities. So we would like to make sure that the voluntary program still exists within this future flow regulation that we're definitely going to be encountering on a long-term basis in the Scott and Shasta River. Thank you.
Next, we'll invite Angelina Cook to come in and unmute.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, my name is Angelina Cook. I am calling on behalf of California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance, and I would just like to reiterate my colleagues' gratitude to the Water Board for doing what's required to ensure that sufficient in-stream flows remain in the Scott and Shasta rivers to reverse our current trends toward extinction of a keystone species that have been instrumental in shaping the watersheds and communities in Northern California. I fully support continuation of the emergency regulations until a point where the Water Board can establish more stable, more sufficient permanent in-stream flow requirements for salmon. I support sentiments stated today about increasing the gauges and points of compliance. Both the Scott and Shasta river systems are complex, and they definitely warrant more than just a few gauges, in-stream flow gauges and points of compliance. I also urge the Water Board to take a stronger stance on cost-effective opportunities for water savings, such as with the inefficient livestock watering and other conservation measures that could easily occur if there were more incentives and mandates to conduct the water savings. And I also want to say I've been trying to work with Siskiyou County and the groundwater sustainability agencies since the inception of SGMA, and I do not see a real interest in transforming agricultural water use through the GSAs to ensure that farms and fish can coexist. I think if anything, they've exhibited a predisposition against water regulation and have also illustrated their tendencies to use as much as they can whenever they can. So I applaud their efforts to promote voluntary agreements, but I would suggest that they adopt much more transparent, accountable, accessible participation of diverse interests in the communities in order for voluntary agreements to be successful through the GSAs. Their business dealings would have to be much different. And I just would like to close by reporting that I visited Jenny Creek up on the Klamath this weekend and saw salmon spawning. And I'm just so encouraged that Klamath Dam removal is already starting to have its intended effect. And I really encourage the Water Board to continue with your responsibility and duty to the public trust and the tribal trust that we need to do whatever we can to rebalance agricultural water needs with in-stream flow requirements for this essential keystone species to our region. Thank you so much.
Next, we'll call Nick Jocelyn.
Hi, Nick Jocelyn, longtime resident of Siskiyou County. I'd like to thank the board for giving us the opportunity to comment again here today. And I would like to urge the board to continue with the readoption of the e-regs for the 2025 irrigation season. I also would like to urge the board to consider that when any voluntary actions are called for by irrigation groups, that they should be directed to engage with all stakeholders in the region. I think sometimes, especially with the LCS and the SCOT, it's really hard to review some of that information, and apparently so hard that the Water Board doesn't even fully review all of them before the irrigation season ends. But someone mentioned Shasta producers having some collaborative idea for the Shasta, and it's never been presented to anyone. So I'd urge any of those entities to engage further with outside collaborators to see if we can find solutions with better buy-in. Thanks for the opportunity to comment. We'll be submitting written comments as well.
Thank you. Looks like the next one is a telephone caller ending 206. You can press *6 to unmute yourself. Please introduce yourself as well.
What number would you call?
This one, 206.
It probably is me.
Yes.
So I'll take the shot. Since you're talking to me, it must be me, and you can hear me all right, so I don't have to ask you that.
Yeah, we can.
My name's Andy Colonna, C-O-L-O-N-N-A. I've been here since '73. And I love fishing for salmon, as well as riding horses, and really value the quality of the produce that comes out of the Scott River. But the problem is balance. I'm sorry. This is really problematic to me because a lot of people's livelihoods really depend on it. We're at a survival point now where a lot of boats are tied up because we've been shut down for a couple of years now, and it doesn't look like we're going to get much better unless we take this bull by the horns and go further than we have before. So far, we keep talking about minimum flows, and I think that's a mistake because if you index us to minimum, to what people call belly scraping or whatever, you're not going to get there. We're going to continue to manage the decline of this resource. that is supporting of these stocks. And I really appreciate the first two speakers today because it's clear that some of them up there are getting it and they care. And I know there's more of you too. So I think in the wake of the recent November 5th experience we all shared, it should be useful to keep in mind as we deliberate today and tomorrow and going forward that most of the best environmental protective laws and plans and implementing regs were enthusiastically endorsed in the statements made by the most conservative Republican presidents and some Democrats in statements they made upon signing them into our state and federal public laws. And so I will be spelling some of these out in more detail in our public, in the written comments by the November 20th deadline. But, you know, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Governor Reagan signed sequence the law and then signed enthusiastically the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act for California, following the lead set by a Democrat president, LBJ, in '68. It took till '86 to get some of these done. And when he signed the Trinity Restoration Act in 1984, reflecting back on the signing statement, I'm talking about Reagan now, as president, that he made in as governor in '72. And that was a key thing. It was October of 1984, before his attempt to get the coveted second term as president, which he did in a landslide. Who
Andy, you're breaking up a little bit. I don't know if you need to move, but you broke up.
Okay, how about this? Is this better?
You're better now.
Okay, I don't know if I'm better, but it can hear me. Okay, so the thing I think we need to start doing is talking about what they did in these legislative mandates is optimum flows, because you can't get there with the minimum flows. And it's clear that we're seeing a continued decline of the salmon stocks over time. So our fish stocks and our other livestock need to get equal consideration, and how and much water and when it gets used and so on every day, all the time. And unless that happens, we're going to end up in the courts, and it's going to get acrimonious and all that, because we cannot afford, from my perspective, to lose this fight. It is a fight. And I think that you guys are playing by the same rules that we are, but our interests are somewhat different. We have to have a recovery that involves a harvestable surplus, or we cannot go out there and chase these fish around. And we're bringing extremely high quality, heart-friendly, omega-rich protein to the market that as good as anything you can buy at any price. So please bear that in mind. Thank you. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you for calling in. Well, next we'll call Justin Fredrickson. Come in and unmute.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Justin Fredrickson. I'm an environmental and water policy analyst at the California Farm Bureau, and I was mostly just going to listen, but the other comments have been interesting enough that I'll just weigh in with a couple of comments. And but I'll start by saying that the two of the criteria that you have for the input that you're seeking, I think are good criteria if applied, faithfully and fairly, even-handedly, and those being that proposals be sort of broadly locally supported, and also be supported by diversity of interests. And in terms of I think that if that goal is posited as a common goal, and if that common goal is to do all that we can for these fish, in a reasonable manner on balance with other beneficial uses, then I think that those are two really good goals. So when I look at what the agricultural producers in the area are doing, and it's been acknowledged in some of the comments here. I think they're really showing up and stepping up in a big way. It's not perfect, just as I don't think anyone would say that, you know, the water board's own efforts have been perfect, nor have anyone's. This is an imperfect animal that we're trying to move forward with at this point, and it's also been acknowledged we're trying to tweak it and perfect it. Some things that I heard mentioned today that were triggers and working on data, and there also appear to be limitations in terms of staff time and resources to get kind of the quality that you're demanding of the agricultural water users, who are doing quite a lot here. They're doing a real heavy lift. And yet when you talk about things about, you know, imperfect things about the system that we have to work with, like insufficient gauging or upstream areas or an inability to time water to come down in a predictable manner, those are things that I'm thinking maybe some of that could be filled in through monitoring by the stakeholders in the area beyond just you know what the water board or the Fish and Wildlife Service is able to do. I know there are land access issues and things like that there. And then there's also the GSP. There's lots of monitoring going, or excuse me, Sigma and the GSA. There's lots of monitoring going on there that I think we could piggyback on. And so I think those are things that maybe can be tweaked and made better in this next iteration, what that looks like, whatever that looks like. And I don't know if that's an emergency regulation. Again, one of the fundamental objections that we have there was mentioned that if you're not in an actual drought, then how do you still have a drought emergency? And then there are shortcomings that I think everyone is acknowledging about emergency regulations that have to be done in a hurry again and again and again. You know, so I don't want to ramble too much. I think I'm already doing that. Just a couple of things that I do hear talked about seldom are things like causation. You know, what is causing these fish declines, and where do we place the, you know, what is the causation behind that, and what can reasonably be demanded of one, you know, set of users in the system versus the rest of the system, which is much larger. I don't hear that talked about. And proportionality is something related to that. I hear when we talk about long-term flows, lots of people are talking about recovery flows, and, you know, we have to recover these fish. And of course, that's everyone's goal. But if you look at fish populations in general throughout California, generally they're not, over time, they've not, you know, they're not moving in the right direction. And in a watershed like this, there's really been no change in water use. Actually, they've become far more efficient, and they're doing far more than ever for the fish, yet the fish are declining. So why is that? You know, these are things that when we talk about the goal and we try to balance that on against other things that we need to be doing with our limited water supply, what is the attainability of that? I think that conversation needs to happen at some point, and I just don't see it ever mentioned. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to blather on. I appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much. That is the end of our speaker queue. So I'll give one last call for raised hands, as well as any that are on the Hmong language channel. You're certainly able to raise your hand on that as well. And again, for the phone callers, *9 to raise your hand and join our speaker queue. But at this point, I see no one and no new hands. So I'll give it a second or two, and then we will call this meeting to its conclusion. Being no more, I'll just close with a reminder that the verbal or the written comments are due November 20th at 12 noon. Preferred submission is via email to scottshastadrought@waterboards.ca.gov. And again, if others have questions, you can give us an email to that email box, or give us a phone message at 916-327-3113, and we will get back in touch with you shortly. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today and joining us. I appreciate hearing from everyone. And we will call this meeting to its end. Thank you.